In the following video, I'm going to show you a technique that helped me to break away from pornography addiction. I'm not a doctor nor a professional movie maker, and for a very long time I kept this approach to myself. Just recently I shared it with some of my friends in recovery, and they found it very helpful, so I decided to share it with the rest of the world. The first major component in my own recovery was an understanding that pornography viewing was not just a bad habit. It was an obsessive compulsive cycle that I was engaging in. For me, it usually started with a sexual thought that I didn't want, which it would make me feel guilt, and I would try to avoid the thought for as long as I could. Eventually, I would get to the point where I couldn't handle the pressure any longer, and I would go back to the only way I knew how to make those thoughts temporarily go away: watching pornography and masturbating. After that, I would come back to my senses. I would feel guilt and regret for being so weak and giving in again, and I would swear to never do it again. Unfortunately, over time I would find sexual thoughts coming back, and since I didn't know how to handle them in a healthy way, I would try once again to push them away for a while, but eventually the whole cycle would repeat itself. Clearly this cycle didn't help my thoughts to go away, and it only made them come back stronger and faster, and I began to try to rely more and more on my behavior to help me escape the sexual thoughts. And eventually this cycle got completely out of control, to the point where I would have to spend most of my day watching pornography, looking at a really hardcore stuff in order to temporarily satisfy my desires and allow myself to return to a normal state. In other words, I found that the more I fed my addiction, the bigger it got. The biggest lesson that I learned at first is that the human craving is shaped kind of like a bell curve, meaning it gets really intense. And most of addicts in any addiction, including pornography addiction, would get used to the fact that they could never get past their craving, and that their cravings will eventually get so strong they will have to have no choice but to give in. In actuality, however, we as human beings cannot sustain any emotion or any kind of feeling for a long period of time, and eventually any feeling, including cravings, will decrease. So the trick is to ride out your craving, and the more you learn to ride out your craving, the less your cravings will become. Which of course sounds nice, but as many of us addicts know, it is not as easy to do. So I'm going to share with you a technique that I learned that helped me to do just that. But before we do that, I wanted to point your attention towards a certain physiological changes that begin to take place in your body right before you're about to act out. Rapid pulse, increased blood pressure, your eyes dilate, and your breath gets shallow. And the reason it is so important is because we can use this information to help us on our way to recovery. We can use our pulse to measure our current state. We can learn our normal pulse and recognize if it is getting too high. We can use it as an indicator that we are about to get out of control. At the same time, we can remeasure pulse once again to let us know that the pulse is back to normal, that we are getting out of the danger zone, and that the physical craving begins to decrease. Another very important component is breath. It is the only subconscious bodily function that we can consciously control. Think about it. You cannot control your blood pressure. You cannot control your pulse, but you can control your breath. You can take slow, deep, controlled breaths, and through that, you can affect your subconscious mind. It is very, very powerful key. So let's move right into action. The technique that I used to help me to overcome the craving is called exposure and response prevention, or ERP, and is usually used for obsessive compulsive disorder and other psychological problems. It is very effective. It's been around for 20 or 30 years at least, and millions of people have used it very successfully and it works real well. And the key idea of technique is that you practice avoiding certain behaviors where still strong. The key word is practice, repeated practice. So by the time your real craving kicks in, your body has already learned a new response. In order to do that, you systematically expose yourself to the trigger, which usually would cause you to engage in addictive behavior, but instead you practice a healthy response. Over time, you will learn that the cravings do not rule your life, and that there is a way for you to ride out a craving and return to your normal self without having to act out. And the high that you get from feeling proud of yourself will be much stronger than any high that you could possibly get from any kind of addiction. ERP works in the following way. You first identify the trigger, and as soon as you feel a physiological response from your body, you measure your pulse rate, which you would usually find to be a bit higher than your normal pulse. After that, you immediately shift into controlled breathing exercise to calm yourself down. Next, you review your personal motivation statements to remind yourself of all the positive things that you can bring into your life if you were not to act out. Then you measure your pulse again and note the difference. Last but not least, you follow up with an act of self-care. Let's look at those steps in a little more detail.